Right, well, thank you very much everybody for coming along tonight to show a bit of interest in the book. But before I go into the story of the book, I thought I'd just start go back to why I wrote the book in the first place. So I'll keep it short as I can because it's a long story. But basically, back in 2009, I found the old family graveyard, and in the course of that, I found the grave of my ancestor that fought at Culloden and Prestonpans and Falkirk. And I sort of just instant decision there that the graveyard needed to get sorted out because it was just, well, to be honest, you couldn't see it was a graveyard. It was just surrounded by trees and bushes and thorn bushes and such like. That was back in 2009 when I was a young man. But and then good fortune in 2016, David Fraser, who was in charge of the community council at the time, got in charge and we hatched a plan to renovate the old graveyard. So that was it in 2016. As I said, in 2009 you couldn't even see anything. There was no fence around it. You couldn't even see the monument. It was just a huge clump of overgrown trees, thorn bushes. You couldn't see any of the walls, the metal, nothing at all. So when I came back in 2016, David had arranged to put a fence around it to protect it from the cows, because it ended up in the middle of a cow field, so with bulls and all that scratching themselves on it over the decades and centuries, that's what the thing caved the wall in. So we got together and hatched a plan, and by hook or by crook we managed to raise about £70,000 to renovate it. And then, so that was it stripped back, and then you could at least see it then, you know, the walls and the railings, and it looked worse. It's better covered than green, I think, you know. But you sort of saw what had to be done then. But obviously David's got a lot of local contacts, and you know, everyone did their bit. And that was just the state of the walls. You know, some of the trees had been allowed to grow and undermine the walls, and so they were starting to fall apart as well. And then again, just the state of the railings. The old monument again, just stained, the concrete cap on top, which water was filtering through that and then staining the marble. So it was a state as well. But that was after a renovation. We had a specialist company in and cleaned it and replaced the broken marble, replaced some of the stone at the bottom, and then put a new lead roof on top. And then it was 35 tons of chips. We got chips up from Alvey near Alvey which matched the original ones. And then, so the walls were completely taken apart. I'll never forget the morning coming up and when the walls had been taken apart, and I just felt I'd been involved in a huge act of vandalism. That was, you know, but it had to be done. It's all the old stone copings were all cracked. We were going to try and use as much of the original material as possible, but once the railings started to come out, it had to be heated. They were bedded in with lead, and then the blow torch would just crack the stone copings, so they all had to be replaced as well. And then that was it, pretty much finished in 2021. So COVID obviously held things up a bit, but we got there in the end. Just to finish. So hopefully we can keep it in that sort of condition. And then we'll start the story in the book. So this was Urquhart Castle, artist's impression of it around 1520. So basically the simplest way to explain it is back in 1509, back in 1480, so 17 generations ago, our ancestor Duncan Grant First of Fookie took on the lease of Urquhart. Pretty lawless land in those times. The MacDonalds had it. MacDonald's Lords of the Isles, you know, they were as powerful as the Scottish King. So they sort of controlled the area, it sort of became lawless. just a no man's land really. So Duncan Grant, he sort of started bringing law and order to the place, and gradually over a sort of 20-year period, he was successful in that. And then it was his grandson in 1509 was given Urquhart and Glenmoriston, an area of 150 square miles by King James IV. One of the conditions was that you had to repair the castle, because a lot of the walls and all that were ruined, so you had to repair the castle, build bridges and roads, continue bringing law and order and taxation so that the crown could get some revenue. So John Grant, second of Urquhart, he had 3 sons. The eldest son carried on the direct line of the chiefs of Grant. The second son, who I'm descended from, was given the barony of Corrimony, and the third son was given Glenmoriston, so he was the founder of the Grants of Glenmoriston. So, their job was to, again, bring law and order. That was the priority, and they were to be the king's men in the area. But it didn't really go according to plan, because, over the preceding century, the next 150 years, they gradually just went native, really. It wasn't as quite as easy as everybody thought. You bring law and order, but in the area it was a Jacobite area. You were rubbing shoulders with the Jacobite clans. It was a case of the best thing, if you can't beat them, is to join them, and that's what they gradually did. So by the time the First Jacobite Rebellion came in 1689, instead of fighting for the king, they fought for the Stuarts. So this monument here was built to James Grant, 3rd of Shugley. So the story of him was in 1689, he went to join the Jacobite army, which was gathering in Lochaber. So they were building up forces, waiting for a lot of men to come from the west. Provisions were low, so they then went to Strathspey, which was again a sort of fertile area. The army went through Strathspey and sort of marauding as they went, and steal whatever they could. And in the course of that, there were several stragglers were captured by the Laird of Grant, and he hung them all at Duffel near Carbridge. So a couple of months later, the Camerons thought, well, they were running low of supplies in Lochaber. James Grant didn't go to Strathspey, because if he came up against the Laird of Grant, he would have lost his lands. So he stayed in Urquhart. But the Camerons, so that was the army of John Graham of Claymore House, Bonnie Dundee. So about 80 of the Clan Cameron came to Urquhart, partly as an act of revenge, and they stole about 100 cattle, sheep, goats, things like that. So James Grant of Shugley, although nothing was touched in his lands because he was a known Jacobite, he still had the job of, all his tenants got robbed, so he still had to put a force together to go and to catch the Camerons and try and get all the things they'd stolen to come back. So there was a period of mediation, but then a firefight started. The Camerons had a better firearms, so the battle ensued. There was about 9 men from Urquhart killed, a number of the Camerons, and James Grant Shugley fell in a place called Corribui, which is about 4 miles up in the hills above Shugley. And when they were killed, they built little cairns to them up in Corribui. And we went up there a few years ago, David Fraser and the local community council and sort of heritage group. And quite remarkably, those little cairns are still there, 340 years later. They're just small little piles of stones now, as opposed to cairns. But it's still remarkable that they were there. There's not many folk daft enough to go wandering about up in the hills, I suppose. That's why they're still there. But anyway, this was built by the local heritage group to commemorate the battle, which was fought on the 27th of June, 1689. And so the following month, there was 150 men from Urquhart and Glenmoriston went to fight in the Battle of Killiecrankie. John Grant of Glenmoriston led them there. Pretty savage battle, which again was a win for the Highlanders, although there was about 30% less of them than there was the opposing forces, but just the ferocity of the charge won the day. Wasn't really Scotland against England. Most of the Redcoats were Lowland Scots, but pretty gruesome battle. It's detailed in the book. That's the sign there, the brass plaque to commemorate the battle. And then back to the graveyard again. So again, David found the grave of James Grant at Shoebury. So he was buried there. We believe his brother was buried alongside him. He died in the same engagement. So that was from 1689. And we knew that the grave was visible when the permission for the graveyard was given in 1800, but it just got covered with stone and dirt and all that. So that was quite fine. And then it was the sons of these two men who fought for the Jacobites in the 1715 at Sheriff Muir, and then it was their grandsons that fought for the Jacobites in 1745. And then we come to the Grants of Strathspey, who allegedly were royalists. So that was the 1745. So on the 11th of September 1745, there was 20 young men from the Shoebury estate went to join the Jacobite army. We know that from a letter written by the factor of Urquhart. He said the two Shoebury sons and all their cousins and relations on that estate went to join the Pretender's army. They then marched, they then met their uncle, Patrick Bowie at Glenmoriston. He had another 80 men there, so there was 100 of them then marched on Edinburgh. They arrived there in the morning of the 20th of September, which was just one day before the Battle of Preston Pans. So they managed to get a bit of rest, and then the next day they fought at the Battle of Preston Pans. So that again, Jacobite victory, and after that there was about 6 weeks where they waited in Edinburgh building up their forces. Patrick Grant of Loughletter was a name known round here. He was sent back to Urquhart to recruit more men for the Jacobites. His brother Alexander stayed in Edinburgh, and at that stage they wrote a number of letters back to Shoebury, which fortunately got intercepted. There was about 20 letters, but if the letters hadn't got intercepted, we wouldn't have them today. They're all in the National Archives, and they just give an account of what's going on in Edinburgh, how the army's building up, and just saying how they're looking forward to heading to London to finish the job. And then we come to Charles Edward Stuart. So when he raised the Royal Standard at Glenfinnan on the 19th of August, soon after that, about the 21st of August, old Shoebury sent one of his nephews to the Prince, assuring him that the men of Urquhart and Glenmoriston were ready to join him, just as they had in the previous engagements. And then Charles Edward Stuart sent a letter back to Shoebury, assuring him that he's looking forward to meeting him. And the plan at that stage was for the Jacobite army to go to Inverness and raise the Frasers and the Macintoshes, and if they'd done that, they would have had a double size of the army. They did, but they heard General Cope was coming to try and intercept them, so they crossed the Corriaric Pass, and then General Cope, he basically bottled it, decided it would be much better to go to Inverness rather than fighting the Jacobites. So then the Jacobites had full access to the south of Scotland. That's the Corriaric Pass, which is from Fort Augustus, goes over into Lagan, and then they went down through the Dromoctor into Perth, into Edinburgh, and then they building up their forces there. They then went to, on the 2nd of December, November, the Jacobite army was about 5,000 strong, marched into England. It had never been their intention to, it was like a nut trying to crack a sledgehammer, really. They marched into England, but they were always told that the Stuarts, their forces would rise in England as well. They were also told that a French army was going to land any day. So they were really just one part of the army that they intended to march on London with. Once they got to Derby, it became obvious then that the so-called support wasn't going to rise for the Stuarts. They then knew that there was two armies, about 10,000 men, sort of converging on them. They also believed there was a third army. They were infiltrated by a Jacobite spy called, his proper name was Oliver William. He passed himself off as a Jacobite gentleman called Dudley Bradshaw, and he convinced them that there was a third army coming upon them. So at that stage, they thought there was 30,000 people marching upon them. So it would have been lunacy to carry on. Little did they know that over the channel, and most history books don't even mention this, is that there was a French army waiting to land in London, which was commanded by Henry Benedict, that was Prince Charles' younger brother. But they just didn't know about each other, you know, what they would have given for a couple of mobile phones. So they just took the decision to march back. But then, so the Grants of Shugley and Glenmoriston were in the Glengarry regiment. So they fought the rear guard and all the way back into Scotland. Normally what happens is a regiment would take turn about. So one day they would fight in the rear because they were being pursued by Cumberland's troops and local militias. But the Glengarry regiment, Lord George Barry commanded them, and because they respected him, they fought in the rear for 4 days. So they were constantly getting harassed by dragoons. So they were basically, what always happens with any army is the artillery falls behind because it's so heavy. So their job was really to safeguard the artillery. So a lot of the times wagons were breaking, so they were actually carrying cannonballs for quite a distance. The weather was atrocious. You know, you're in winter, ice, snow, constantly getting attacked by the dragoons. And then they wouldn't stand and fight, so as soon as the Highlanders went to attack them, they would then run off on their horses. They didn't fancy coming to grips with them, really. So that carried on for about 4 days. Then they had a fight in a village called Clifton, where they gave Cumberland a bloody nose. So again, the Shugley Grants and Glenmoriston were there. It was about 800 against 1,000. It was about 80 or 90 of Cumberland's troops were killed. You don't really hear much about it because it was a Scottish victory, but that was actually, so there were all these Shugley Grants and the Grants of Glenmoriston all fought in the last battle ever fought on English soil. After that, they then went back to up at Falkirk, where again they fought another battle on the 17th of January. That was actually the largest army that Jacobites they had. They had about 9,000 at that. And again, that was a Jacobite victory, fought on again, very bad weather, light was disappearing. So although they won, they didn't follow up the victory because it was just getting dark. And if they'd followed up the victory, it would have been beneficial for them because that was virtually the same army that they fought at Culloden 3 months later. One of Shugley's sons was killed at the Battle of Falkirk in the charge of English dragoons. And then we come to Culloden, where six of the Shugley Grants, or known Shugley Grants, fought at Culloden. A couple of them were killed there. Culloden, you know, we were always brought up to being told that the Grants never fought at Culloden. And my father, who worked in the tail trade all his life, our family always worked in the tail trade for the last couple of 100 years, and he clarified that by saying, although the Grants didn't fight at Culloden, they did the catering at the Marquee. So we didn't play our little part, you know. But despite all the archaeological excavations that have been around the site of the battlefield, we've still never found any remains on the Marquee, so that's unproven as yet. Wasn't too bad enough. So this is actually the stuff mill that belonged to Old Shugley. So basically after Culloden, Ludwig Grant gathered up all the Grants in Strathspey, and they marched to Inverness, where they spent a few days going around the Fraser and Macintosh country, gathering in arms, and then they went down to Urquhart, where their intention was to hunt down the Jacobite grants of Urquhart and Glenmoriston. But after a whole week, they only captured about 4 or 5 of them. I don't think they were really looking too hard. But this is so basically at that stage, Ludwig turned to Old Shugley and he said, right, you know where they are. Old Shugley was quite a character. He was a renowned musician, playing equally good on the harp and the fiddle and the pipes. He was an extensive farmer over at the Shugley estate. They say that he worked the tenants quite hard. He was just a reputed possessor of the evil eye. He was a renowned character in his day, and always up to something. And a very, very busy man indeed. In fact, so busy was he that when the 45 came round, he was the father of 14 sons and 6 daughters. So he was kept very busy in that department as well. And so Old Shugley then went round the people of Urquhart and Glenmoriston and said, right, come in, and Ludwig is going to intercede in our behalf with the Duke of Cumberland. So just come in, hand in your arms. So that's what they did. So the very next day, on the 4th of May, 84 Urquhart and Glenmoriston men handed themselves into Ludwig at Palmacan, and then the next day they were all marched to Inverness, and that's where he betrayed them and handed them all into the Duke of Cumberland. So it's quite a notorious act. No chief in the long and turbulent history of the Highlands ever handed his own people into the hands of the enemy. But the book will actually go into what really happened and why he betrayed them. But a beautiful little object. This sold for nearly £4,000 a couple of years ago. And it's only a couple of inches, 2.5 inches high. Made of ebony and ivory. Beautiful little thing. Obviously, he left that in his house before he went off to convince the men to surrender, and never came back for it. And then, once he was betrayed, so what happened was Ludwig had, back 7 months previously, the letter that Charles Edward Stuart sent to Shugley, Ludwig's factor managed to get his hands on it, and then he hid it, he buried it. And so he eventually got it to Ludwig, and then Ludwig showed the letter to the Duke of Cumberland in Inverness, and then Duke of Cumberland immediately ordered that Shugley should be arrested. His fate was sealed there. And then he was sent down to, this is Tilbury Fort, which was built in the 15th century, an artillery fort on the River Thames. It was built to stop the French and Spanish ships coming up the Thames. So that's where he was imprisoned after Culloden. Quite a remarkable place, really impregnable, but quite a place. Now, remarkably, when he was in there, something happened that should never have happened. Now, I think a couple of the slides are mixed up here. Once he was in Tilbury, this man intervened. Now, this man was John Dalrymple, the second Earl of Stair. He was responsible for the defence of Britain during the 1745 rebellion. So he was a Hanoverian. If the Jacobites had marched on London, he was going to lead the army against them. So here was this, probably next to King George himself, so you'd meet King George every morning. He was at the top of the Hanoverian tree, but yet he interceded for Old Shugley, and he personally represented him. So he was a renowned European diplomat as well. But so here was the commander of forces in Britain. So apart from Cumberland, he was the main man, and here was him intervening for Shugley, which should just never have happened. I mean, what connection did he have with a little guy from Urquhart? But obviously I'm not going to tell you what that connection is. But, and then, so I'll now move on, because obviously it's such a big book and I'm just trying to pick little parts of it. But I'll go back to this here. So this is where the fate of the Urquhart and Glenmoriston men was sealed. So this is a place called, one of the standard stones of Ballintom, which is just outside Grantham. This was a traditional mustering point for Clan Grant and had been for 1,000 years. The Gaelic name, from pronunciation won't be correct, but it's called Tom and Cara. And so there was a meeting took place here on the 10th of March, Monday the 10th of March, 1746, and it's what happened there that sealed the fate of Urquhart and Glenmoriston men, although they didn't know that at the time. But then move on to, so we'll move away from the Claudian era. Really, although Ludwig tried to intervene with the Duke of Newcastle for the Urquhart and Glenmoriston men, they would have probably been better off if he hadn't. So they spent 10 months on the prison hulks at Tilbury. So these were just rotten ships that weren't fit to go to sea, but they were kept prisoner there. There was about 3,200 Jacobite prisoners held in the prison ships at Tilbury. So although they started off in Tilbury, eventually they were put onto the ships. Horrible conditions, obviously there was no medical treatment. Didn't even get fresh air because they were kept below decks and very unsanitary, very poorly fed. I mean, although there was an official ration each day of dried meat and bread and cheese, but a lot of the ship's captains would just sell the food off. That was a nice little earner for them, so they would, a lot of the time they wouldn't get fed. Even the water, the buckets of water, the soldiers would just urinate in the buckets of water and make it undrinkable. So it was remarkable that so many of them actually survived. So they were eventually transported to Barbados. All the details are in the book, the names, where they came from, their ages. They were sent to Barbados. About 8 years later, there was about 18 of them still alive. A few of them made their way back, managed to make their way back to Urquhart and Glenmoriston, but the vast majority died in Barbados. I mean, it wasn't the Sunshine Isle holiday destination back then, it was just an island, no roads. Their jobs, they were indentured slaves. So indentured slaves were better, if you like, than being a normal slave, because your term of service was 8 years, and after 8 years, if you survived, you were given passage home. You could return back to your own country. But pretty grim conditions. I mean, again, food was very, very basic. Protein, the only meat they ever got was like if a goat died or something, they would get to eat the remains of that. So again, no days off. I think they got half a day off on a Sunday, 12-hour days in the heat, lots of snakes and all that, lots of obviously diseases that their bodies had no resistance to. So it was remarkable that any of them made their way home, but some of them did. And then we go to India, because although Shukri had so many sons that some of them were killed, but Alexander, he's one of the main ones. So Alexander made his way. In those days, the firstborn son got everything. So young James of Shukri, he was arrested along with his father, but eventually released. So he inherited the estate, if you like. The second son, Patrick, got Lochletter. The second son in the family always had Lochletter, which was like I think it was about 400 or 500 acre farm. Anyway, he'd get that. The third son got nothing. So Alexander headed to India and joined the ranks of the Honourable East India Company. And then he ended up in 1756. He ended up being the Adjutant General at the siege of Fort William in Calcutta. Not a great job. He was only appointed the day before the opposing army came. So you had the Nawab of Bengal was sick fed up with the East India Company because they were making up the rules as they go along, trading but not paying him any taxes. So he decided he would teach them a lesson. So he put together an army of 40,000 men, and they marched on Fort William. And Alexander was given the job. Thanks very much. So he had 500 men against 40,000. So they managed to hold out for about 3 days, and he wrote this fantastic account, which is in the book. It's a 40-page account, which is historically recognised as the most complete account of the siege and what happened there. He was literally the last man to escape, got on the last boat, narrowly avoiding. So the survivors, this is where the story of the Black Hole of Calcutta came from. So that was a story that everybody knew once, long ago. But basically what happened was the survivors, so there was 160 men left that survived the battle. And they were all put in a guard room, which was about 18 foot by 14 foot. They were all crammed in there and basically left overnight with no water. Most of them would have been quite badly injured from the fighting. And in the morning, there was only about 18 of them alive. Most of them suffocated. They got no water, all crammed into this room. And most of them just suffered horrible death, the mixture of the delirium and suffocation. A horrible death. So Alexander, he escaped. He went upriver. There was a settlement up there where some of the survivors went to. He was going to be court-martialed, but once they did a proper investigation, they accepted that there was nothing more he could do. He actually followed the governor of the fort out of the castle, and then when Alexander was in the boat, he tried to get the skippers. There was 4 or 5 boats on the River Hooghly, and he tried to say, get back to the walls and we'll get the other survivors off. But the ships were privately owned, they weren't owned by the East India Company, so the captains wouldn't do it. They just left them to their fate, And anyway, the next year, the following year, he fought at the Battle of Plassey, when he commanded a European regiment. So the East India Company got their revenge there. So again, remarkable odds. The East India Company had about 3,500 men versus about 40,000 Indians again. But the main advantage they had, there was a big downpour, and the British covered their cannons, which are pollens, the Indians didn't. So, when it rains over there, it just comes down in sheets. So once the rain stopped, the battle commenced, and the British cannon were just obliterating Indians. The Indian cannon weren't working at all. The British were always very good at divide and conquer. So they would pay off. They would basically the Nawab was really just a prince, but there was always contenders who wanted to be the Nawab. The British were all very good at going to them and saying, look, if you side Glasser, don't do this, don't do that, we'll give you the job once we're finished with him. So they were successful in the battle. Alexander, as part of that, he was given £11,000 sterling, which was a huge amount of money in those days. And it was that money that was absolutely no doubt whatsoever, that money that rebuilt. So his brother built Shugley House. It was burnt down after Culloden, but the families participating with the Jacobite. It was that money that was used to rebuild Shugley House in 1762, and also Loughletter House was destroyed. That was rebuilt as well. There were big houses in their time. Loughletter House it was sadly burnt. It is no more. It's a lot bigger than Shugley House. But it was definitely the money from the Plassey that rebuilt those properties. And then we'll move on. So that was the Nawab of Bengal. So after the battle, basically, if you're on the losing side, there was always someone. It wasn't long before you found a knife at your throat. And so his own supporters ended up killing him, and then a new Nawab took control. That's just a map of where the Battle of Plassey was. Now, the Battle of Plassey was one of the pivotal battles that really put Britain in control of India, because they won that battle and did a deal with the next Nawab, they were able to take control of huge areas of India. And if you controlled these areas, you were then able to gain taxation. So the taxation gained from these areas is really what, this was these were really the founders of the British Raj in India. So Alexander was, and the money, and then the more money you had, you could build up your armies. So At the Battle of Plassey, their army was only 3,500 people. After that, the following decade, because they had all that money, they built their army up. The East India Company was a private company, and they built their army up to about 240,000, which again just gave them more and more control over other parts of India. So that's what really, that was the foundation of the British Raj. And then several years later, another of Shubley's sons, Hugh, called Hugh of Moy, he commanded a regiment of 900 soldiers at the Battle of Buxar. That was fought in October 1764. So that he was in charge of a regiment 900, and they had 16 pieces of artillery. So again, the Battle of Buxar, again, a lot more Indians, about 42,000 Indians versus about 16,000 British. But they weren't actually all British, because what the British did was they trained up sepoys, which were Indian soldiers, and trained them. The reason the Brits did so well in these battles was just came down to discipline. You know, the Indians were just a bit like the Highlanders, really. It was all or nothing. It was just charge, and there was no discipline. Whereas the British, they trained the Indian soldiers, so rank after rank, a musket fire, and they would just decimate them, and eventually they would turn tail. So again, the Battle of Buxar, that sealed it. That really put the East India Company in charge of India. So quite remarkable, really. Plassey and Buxar, without doubt, the most pivotal battles which led to the British foundation and gave the British power in India. But quite remarkable that two brothers from Shubley played commanding roles in those battles. So that's just a typical image of the Indian sepoys. They must be twins, that pair of identical twins. Another one of Shubley's sons, Charles Grant, he was the youngest, 14th son. He ended up joining. So after Culloden obviously decimated the economy of the Highlands, such as it was, several years later they realised that you've still got all these men who were trained to fight, and they didn't want another Jacobite rebellion. So really, they formed the Highland regiments and sent them to fight mainly in North America. So it was a good way of getting rid of these guys and also extending the power of the British Empire. So Charles joined Montgomery's Highlanders, and then they went to fight in America. He was captured at the Battle of Fort Donetsk, where it was basically it was a 7-year period. It was called the French and Indian Wars. So the French allied with the native Indians were fighting against the British. Charles, he was captured at the battle. Then he spent 14 months as a slave amongst Indians, the Huron Indians. And then a deal was cut after 14 months by the Rangers, and he was freed. He then joined the Black Watch, and he was in charge of Fort Loudon, which is in Pennsylvania. So he was involved in what was called the Smith Rebellion, and that was the first time that they say that was the spark that lit the American Revolution. That was the first time that the colonists had fought back against British rule, and it was all down to traders. So there was these traders were selling scalping knives to the Indians, and lots of things. Basically, they were getting used against the colonists. So the colonists got together. They reckon the equivalent, they burnt about £1 million worth of knives and things that were destined for the Indians. The traders then went to Fort Loudon to say what had happened. And then so Charles Grant, who was the commander of the fort, got company soldiers together, went and confiscated a load of the rifles, and then obviously that kicked off. So then there was 200 colonists attacked the fort. Charles was captured a couple of days later. He was taken out into the woods, tied to a tree, and they were just going to leave him there, cover him in honey, and then you would have made a nice meal for a nice a brown bear or black bear. She wouldn't have lasted very long. But anyway, they knew that they were getting a lot of trouble for doing that, so anyway, they eventually let him go. It was called the Smith Rebellion. I haven't went into this a lot in the book, but I've left details there, signposts if you like. There's websites and all that deal with it, but it was quite a big incident. And then he carried on, fought all the way through the American War of Independence, fought most of the battles. They were all quite lucky, really. You know, they went through a lot, but they were survivors. That's typical. That was the sort of uniforms they wore in those times, 1757 and 1760. And then we've got another son, Gregor. He was at the Siege of Gibraltar, which that was the longest naval siege in British military history, from 1779 to 1784. So that was a combined force of French and Spanish. This was actually, although it happened in Spain, it was actually part of the American War of Independence, because the French and the Spanish were the ones who were given all the arms to the Americans to fight the British. So there was a besieging force of 64,000 French and Spanish, and then there was about 7,000 British, Scottish soldiers in Gibraltar. So it was just a case of they were building up to the grand assault, to try to starve them. Occasionally British ships would get through with provisions, managed to keep them alive, enough to keep them alive. Again, they were nearly starving, you know, very, very difficult to break through the blockade of the Spanish Navy, but they would manage it. So they spent years building up for this huge attack called the Grand Assault. And then basically 2 days before they did that, the men inside Gibraltar basically came bursting out at night time and basically attacked the French and the Spanish and basically set everything on fire. So all this years that had been building all this stuff, that was all burned in one night, and then eventually they just lost heart after that. So that was Gregor. He's buried in Knockambura as well. And then Captain Charles got a great picture of it. So he was the youngest of the Shugleys. He was born about 4 weeks before the Battle of Culloden. He eventually became the chairman and director of the Honourable East India Company. Very little is known about East India Company these days, but it was a huge company in its day. At one time accounted for half of Britain's trade. It was a private enterprise owned by shareholders, but it traded mainly with India and China, Hong Kong. They were trading everything, spices, mainly in silk, opium, a lot of dealing in opium. Anyway, Charles, he became the chairman and director of the Honourable East India Company. That was a huge role. So he really surpassed the achievements. I mean, there's a lot of them, I can't go into detail, but there's a lot of them made a lot of money. And they came back here and bought estates down at Moy and Contessic and Cullen outside Forest, and then Redcastle as well. So a lot of them did very well for themselves. But so he was a bit of a philanthropist as well. You know, he was in India when there was regularly they ran out of food in India because of the hot weather. And he was there. One year there was about 10 million people died of starvation in India due to lack of food and water. And then he became an MP. He was MP for Inverness-shire from 1802 to 1818. He was one of the main people behind the Caledonian Canal. You know, he wanted to bring prosperity to the Highlands, so he did a lot regarding building bridges and roads and the canal itself. So he was a very, very well-known man in his day. There was also another one who, slides missing there, but an author called Stuart Reid wrote a book about it called Dr. James Grant and the Secret War for Texas. So again, he was a Shugley Grant. He went over, he was a British agent. Basically, Britain was trying to stop America gaining full control of Texas, but then there was the Mexicans fighting the Americans as well. So he eventually became a land speculator. He's gained a lot of notoriety in America because he was blamed of stripping the Alamo of men and arms shortly before the Mexicans arrived, because I think he took about 180 men away from the Alamo. He was a freedom fighter, again fighting for Texas so that it wouldn't get consumed by the Mexicans. So he stripped a lot of the men from the Alamo, but I don't think that would have been very difficult. They knew that the Mexicans were on their way, they knew they didn't stand a chance. And so he was a business partner of David Bowie, you know, these American folk heroes, Davy Crockett, David Bowie. He was rubbing shoulders with them. And although they were both killed at the Alamo, although James wasn't at the Alamo, he was killed about a week later. So General Santa Anna, he'd been a thorn in the flesh of the Mexicans for years and years. General Santa Anna personally ordered his capture and death. Pretty gruesome death, too gruesome to go into here. So yeah, basically wherever the British Empire was, the Shugley Grants were there. There was about 40 of them employed at one time with on the East India Company. Mainly as soldiers, but then accountants, judges and such like. And that's it really. For the rest you'll have to read the book, but that's just a little flavour of some of the stories contained in it. But before we finish, there was a lady who's been a great help to me over the last few years, who's come all the way from the Galapagos Islands for the launch. So I'd like to ask Dot Mackenzie to come up and accept this gift for sign of appreciation for all the effort. So Dot was basically, she operated as my surrogate brain. She my punctuation and such like wasn't very good, so Dot filled a lot of those.